from the Zero Hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. That part of the program never seems to change. And joining me again is a friend I haven't talked to in a while. Max Blumenthal is the author of a number of books. I believe his latest is The Management of Savagery. He is a co-founder and editor, or editor and co-founder of The Gray Zone, which can be found at thegrayzone.com, and he is many more things as well. So first of all, Max, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me back. It's been too long.
Yeah, it has. And you're doing something on Rumble too, or something, aren't you?
I'm not sure. I'm doing
one of those new media outlets. Aren't you doing something?
I definitely would, just because we need to be on as many platforms as possible, as YouTube censors pretty much anything we say these days, demonetizes, suppresses, and issues community guideline warnings if you say the V word, for example. So I'm doing a live stream every week at Rockfin.
Oh, Rockfin. Okay, I knew it was one of those. Yeah.
I guess it's sort of like Rumble in that it's a YouTube competitor. And I try to focus on, at least for the past few weeks, I've been focusing on the COVID issue and, just using it to interrogate power and various, I don't know, it's probably too soft of a word, but reforms that are being enacted on a global basis against the backdrop of the pandemic, how the leadership, particularly of Western countries, is using this opportunity to militarize and monetize its response to the pandemic.
It's such a tremendously important issue, and yet I think that what's going to happen in a lot of circles, probably has happened to you, is that if you raise these issues against which the pandemic and vaccines and so on are almost the backdrop or the platform for what in my view is something else going on, it seems as, Max Blumenthal and the Gray Zone are anti-vax or something, that it gets put in this kind of binary of if you criticize the way we're approaching the management of the crisis, of the pandemic crisis, then you must be the equivalent of, whomever that won't take the vaccine. I mean, have you experienced that?
Of course. And, since we've been having these conversations for a few years, you can see that I've been branded an anti-Semite for my work on Israel-Palestine and trying to understand and interrogate how the Israel lobby influences U.S. politics. I've been called an Assadist for my critical reporting on the dirty war on Syria, which was largely kept from the U.S. public by legacy and corporate media. I've been called a Kremlin shill or Russian spy or asset for challenging the narrative of Russiagate, which has just been exploded in broad daylight in recent weeks with the indictment of several key players in the construction and dissemination of the Steele dossier. And so now, for using the same kind of techniques and applying the kind of critical thinking that I do to every major issue against, and having, been inspired to get into journalism because of the way 9/11 was exploited to consolidate this massive security state and carry out regime change across the Middle East. For just applying that same kind of thinking to the pandemic, yes, I'm branded an anti-vaxxer, and large segments of the organized left or the establishment left are angry with my analysis. And according to them, you're not really supposed to have an analysis. We just are supposed to go along with the proclamations of public health officials, which are constantly shifting. And, just through my conversations with colleagues and people on the left, they all know something's wrong, but many of them self-censor because they're afraid of having this label applied to them, which does have implications, disturbing implications, when you consider that in September, around the anniversary of 9/11, the DHS issued a terror threat warning declaring that there was no specific terror plot, but that people who are critical of vaccine policy in the US were a terror threat. In other words, the concept of being an anti-vaxxer, which according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary means anyone who even opposes mandates, is now being criminalized.
So, what's interesting to me about this is you mentioned 9/11. It seems to me as if 9/11 reignited a kind of bipolar view of the world that had kind of faded away with the first Cold War, and that was during the first Cold War. If you say, this militarization of this nuclear arms buildup and our national security policies or spying on our own citizens, this stuff is kind of bad. Well, you were commie, you were pro-Soviet, you were against the United States. It was binary. You couldn't. And then when 9/11 came, it's like, I'm one of the relatively few Americans who knew several people who died on 9/11. But if you said, this isn't the right response, or, national security escalation is going to worsen the problem, not make it better. Once again, you got that polarity, right? Of, if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. Now I think we're seeing it again with, if there's any aspect of Russiagate, another example, then now, and I always go back to when somebody who is close to me on a lot of issues said, "Oh, I forgot you're a Russiagate skeptic." You're a Russia skeptic. That's what they said. You're a Russia skeptic. To which my response, which I always reiterate, is I'm an everything skeptic. That's my gig, as being a skeptic. Now we have that with, if you don't like aspects of the way we're responding to the pandemic, including the manufacture, distribution of vaccines, or whatever it might be, then you're an anti-vaxxer. Isn't it the same kind of bipolar thinking? That I don't mean it in the clinical sense, but in the just
Manichaean thinking.
Yeah, isn't it? Manichaean is a perfect word. Isn't it the same thing once again?
Well, it is, and these terms are never fully explained. It's just a way of, first of all, appealing to establishment prejudice against the dissenter and applying a pejorative or label in order to shut down debate. Right. And you'll find that on this issue, even more than Russiagate, it is impossible to have a rational or reasoned kind of calm and measured debate on the issues with some, particularly people who are to the left of Tucker Carlson. I mean, it goes through the Democratic Party all the way to the radical left. You have this almost near blanket support or silence in the face of so many violations of human rights and obliteration of legal strictures and concepts that we took for granted in a very in an already weak liberal democratic system. Let's say that's probably an understatement. The purpose of 9/11, not the attack, but the response to it, was to create a state of exception where international law and conventions around torture could be wiped away because the public provided consent to the Bush administration and the Blair administration to do so because it was gripped with fear. And you remember the days after 9/11. I remember people were concerned that bin Laden was going to wage a dirty bomb attack. There was the anthrax, the very mysterious anthrax attacks, to keep the fear going. And the public gave full consent for the Bush administration to create what Carl Schmitt called this state of exception, where laws no longer, the laws of the past no longer apply. And we had to, in the words of Dick Cheney, take the gloves off, begin torturing people, establish the unitary executive, where congressional approval of wars was no longer of interest, the AUMF, emergency authorization. We hear that word so much around the vaccines. What reminds me of the AUMF, which has never been sunsetted since 9/11. So now we have another emergency situation. The threat of the virus, which is real, has absolutely been exaggerated. And we've moved from, I don't know, responsibility to protect the R2P doctrine, where the US has to come in and save some civilian population after we've witnessed so much death, to witnessing death all around us, and the government has to simply do something, and the public has given their consent for the government to do something. It's gone from R2B 2P to R2V, responsibility to vaccinate. And that means mandating vaccines, something that Anthony Fauci said the government would never do, something Joe Biden and Jen Psaki said they would never do, because it seemed unusual and unusually draconian to voters back in 2020. Now they're doing it. Democrats have overwhelmingly supported it. Even a slice of Republicans have. And we're seeing restrictions and human rights violations take place that we never could have imagined. I would have been called a conspiracy theorist if at the beginning of the pandemic, I would have predicted that countries in the heart of Europe, like Austria, would apply a lockdown purely for those who have not taken the vaccine. I would have been called a conspiracy theorist if I had said another country, Slovenia, is now refusing to allow the unvaccinated to buy gasoline. You have to present your health card there in order to buy gasoline. Germany will soon apply a lockdown of the unvaccinated, and lockdowns themselves. And the way we've seen them applied, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, where in the case, if there's 1 or 2 cases, an entire region or country locks down, and all the health effects that has on the public are completely ignored in order to supposedly eradicate an airborne respiratory virus that's simply impossible to eradicate and is endemic. If I had said that any of that would have taken place, I would have been called a conspiracy theorist. But now that I express criticism of it, I'm called a conspiracy theorist. So there's almost no way to win, but I think a large part of the public senses is starting to come to its senses and realizing that the response to the pandemic is not necessarily about public health. It's about private wealth, monetizing the response and militarizing the response. The military intelligence apparatus has been involved in this from the beginning, in the same way that it was involved in a different way than it was involved in 9/11, and in some ways a more intimate way, in the way that censorship and surveillance are creeping into our lives on the grounds of a public health response.
I'll start out by saying, Max, that I have multiple feelings on this subject, right? Because on the one hand, government can and does things to preserve public health, right? I mean, it tries to regulate the safety of drinking water. It issues driver's licenses. It does, various relatively benign things to ensure public safety. But it is possible, in fact, almost inevitable, that any one major issue is going to take place at the intersection of multiple principles. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. What I mean by that is, I, for one, am a high-risk individual. I have a chronic disease. I have a, immunosuppressed system. And so, I would like to be out and about in the world safely, but I am also a person who believes strongly in workers' rights and the autonomy of working people. So I can see encouraging the citizens to get a vaccine, but when employers are used as the instrumentality of the state to impose the vaccine, a little alarm goes off with me. And I mean, one of my other regular guests, Richard Wolff, the economist, as I haven't followed it lately, was being ratioed, as they say on Twitter, for raising this issue of worker autonomy. But to me, it's legitimate to have that conversation. And in another piece you co-wrote on the gray zone, where you talked about the vaccine passport and who's behind it, and the technology and the interest behind it. This to me is vitally interesting. And I did a project for a think tank in Palo Alto 15 years ago where I modeled future possible pandemics. So I dove and I found out, and very few people have written about it, back then that the federal government had already put plans in place to impose internal passports and internal restrictions on travel, a military takeover of transportation hubs and things like that. And, I thought, wow, that sounds dystopian. That's a lot of what you're describing. And it seems to me we should be able to hold more than one thought in our head, which is we want to reduce loss of life from this pandemic, but we also want to be concerned about not strengthening the state, the mix of state and private forces that already have too much control over our lives. Do you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I do. And I think that if there had never been mandates in the US where hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers had a pink slip dangled in front of their face, if they did not want to take a vaccine, and we should talk about what they're being asked to take, then there wouldn't be this hysteria about anti-vaxxers. I mean, you have people around the world, not just masses of people in Italy, in France, protesting vaccine passports, what's called the Green Pass in Italy, where millions of workers are being told that they have to present this in order to get into their very jobs. You have protests in the West Bank in Palestine. You have protests in Tehran. You have protests in Martinique. You have protests in Morocco, massive protests against their vaccine passport system. Now you have protests in Costa Rica and Colombia. All across the global South, protests are cropping up, as well as in New York City. There's a massive protest this Saturday in Central Park, and all across the West. You wouldn't have this if there hadn't been mandates, if people hadn't been forced and coerced, if they had simply been encouraged. And many people who were immunosuppressed or who were in risk groups have mostly gone out and gotten the vaccine. And then we have another problem. And it's the intersection of these two problems that caused me to start raising issues about the pandemic response. First, the coercion and the attacks on workers, obliterating worker rights. As Richard Wolff said, one of the key foundations, core foundations of the labor struggle is that the boss should never have the power to decide what life decisions the workers make. It's up to the workers. That's why workers organize. And so that's why they're opposing these mandates. But the other issue is the vaccine itself. They were rolled out under emergency usage. The trials were shoddy at best. They were approved then by the FDA under very suspect conditions. In one case, the Pfizer vaccine had the control group eliminated. These aren't real trials, so people are naturally suspicious of it. It is using a novel technology called mRNA, which is essentially a gene therapy. And while it has been shown to reduce severe illness or death when people have antibodies, it does not prevent infection. And that's something that everyone from Anthony Fauci to CDC Director Rochelle Walensky admitted. There's a new study in Lancet out this week. It's called Community Transmission and Viral Load Kinetics of the SARS-CoV-2 Delta variant in vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals in the UK. And it clearly shows that the vaccines do not prevent viral transmission. So what does this mean? It means that the mandates are essentially unscientific, because if the vaccines had prevented infection and transmission, then it would mean you're protecting others around you by taking it. And it would mean that there was a logic behind requiring people to take it to go into a workplace, or a logic behind vaccine passports requiring people to take it in order to mingle with others at a bar. But there is no logic there. So what is the point of the mandates and the passports? It feels like simply control. And people feel abused by this. Now, the people who are ratioing Richard Wolff, that's, the laptop left. They don't have a whole lot of connection with workers. But if you go out and talk to workers, including those who have willingly taken the jab under threat of losing their job, they feel like there's been no informed consent that's been violated. Their bodily autonomy has been violated, and their right as a worker has been violated. And all to take a vaccine that doesn't prevent them from giving the virus to others. That's why in Ireland right now, which has over 90% vaccination uptake, you're seeing cases rise massively, and local officials complaining that not enough people had been previously infected by COVID. And so they're starting to be hospitalized, even though they're vaccinated. The same thing is happening in Singapore, which ended its long lockdown and is now being swamped with cases. They have about 85% of people over 12 vaccinated. The most vaccinated place on earth, Gibraltar, close to 100%, is going to cancel Christmas, has announced plans to cancel public celebrations of Christmas because of the massive rise in cases. The Ottawa Senators, the NHL team, the Ottawa Senators, 100% of the players have been vaccinated, and 40% were reportedly infected with COVID over the past week, or in the past week. I could go on, but the logic behind the mandates is not there. And yet so many people.
Well, Max, it seems like there are two logics behind the mandate. Yeah. Okay. One is to reduce transmission, which we now have pretty solid evidence doesn't happen.
Yeah.
The other seems to me to be sounder, which is that it does reduce cases of severe illness, hospitalization, and death. That it does so from a moral principle point of view, right? There were two arguments. They were never really clearly expressed this way, but to me, I think there were two arguments. One was, it is your duty to your fellow citizens to take this vaccine so that you don't infect them, which, you've made a good case is not valid. The other is for your own good, right? That's the other argument, for your own good. We don't want you to be hospitalized or die or get long COVID, which is terrible. So we will mandate you take this vaccine so that doesn't happen. Now, I would argue that the left has not sufficiently analyzed the fact that there are two principles here, that they haven't even broken that out. So when it becomes an issue of for your own good, I want to mandate that you take this, if that is the only principle, then we need to have a debate about whether that is a valid reason for mandating it. I might well think there are forms of persuasion that should be used. I'm just being really honest with you now. I might well think, and I'm thinking as we go, as we talk, so I'll evolve, but I might well think, look, we've got to do everything we can to get shots in people's arms because it will help them. Now, if we go to that point, and forgive me for talking so long, but I just want to lay out the moral landscape as I understand it so that you can either disagree with it or we can talk within it. Now, if the goal is to help other people, it's interesting to ponder whether the mandate is in fact backfired, because more people are resisting because of the mandate than would have taken the shot if it had been presented to them in a clear way why they should take it. So that's my map of the moral landscape, political landscape. How do you agree with it, disagree with it?
Well, the federal court has ruled that Biden's mandate, as applied to companies of 100 workers or more that would be enforced by OSHA, is extraordinarily overbroad in their words. And a point that the judges make, which I think is salient, is that not all workers are the same. You can have a long haul trucker who's in a truck all day by his or herself is very different than someone who's working in a crowded office or a workplace where people are indoors together for long periods. Beyond that, they raised the issue of natural immunity. which is, I think, another blow to the Achilles heel of the mandates and this biomedical security regime that's being erected before our eyes. As we know from a August 2021 study by Tel Aviv University, the largest of its kind, of individuals comparing those who are vaccinated but have not been previously infected versus those who had been previously infected and not vaccinated, they found that immunity is something like 20 times stronger in those who had been previously infected and much more durable. And we're seeing that bear out right before our eyes. I mean, you just look at the numbers of cases. Now, who is most likely to have been previously infected? It's the frontline workers. It's the people who were out there while the laptop class was at home during the lockdowns that they seemed to enjoy. Those are the people who now face the mandates. I mean, the mandates are coming down on the backs of the frontline workers who everyone banged, were celebrated with pots and pans being banged out windows, and they've gone from heroes to zeros. That's who you're seeing at the protests in New York City, is EMS workers, firefighters, restaurant workers, healthcare workers, people who sacrificed throughout 2020 and are now facing the pink slip. So natural immunity has to be recognized here, and it's a hard thing to demonstrate.
Yeah.
So that's another major issue. And then we have the issue of boosters. In lockstep, leaders across the West began making the case for boosters, including Anthony Fauci, who said in an interview that the vaccines wane, the mRNA vaccines wane in efficacy over the course of 6 months. The NBA has declared that players who took the Johnson & Johnson shot, which was supposed to be the one and done shot, more than 2 months ago, have to get a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, or they can't play. And they're recommending boosters for everyone who took the Pfizer or Moderna more than 6 months ago. Why is this the case? Because anyone watching this right now, if you were vaccinated more than 6 months ago, then you are considered unvaccinated in Israel. And not only that, you are not able to go to restaurants or the gym or a spa with your green pass anymore, even if you did your part and got vaccinated, because they're already on their third jab and they're making space for the fourth one. Bloomberg has a piece out that, citing various public health officials and supposed experts on how no one knows how many booster shots you will have to take. And so when you combine this fact with the mandates and the vaccine passports, which are coming in more and more draconian fashion around the world, you have to consider that for the rest of your life, every 6 months, you will have to take a vaccine that, in my view, is still experimental, because it usually takes around 4 to 7 years to adequately test a vaccine and run it through trials. And this one has just been rushed out. You will have to do that for the rest of your life in order to continue participating in society or working. So that is, to me, unacceptable. And I think to many more people, it's unacceptable. And I wonder if the reason that boosters haven't been rolled out so aggressively here and mandated is just to avoid the social catastrophe that's inevitable if they are.
It's an interesting question. I want to divert, if you got a little more time.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about the vaccine passport industry, about the organization called MITRE and all of that, because to me, there will be people listening who, I'm sure, who do believe we should mandate vaccines, who do believe we should have something like a vaccine passport. I think even those people should understand what's happening in their name and who exactly is being groomed to administer that. And so maybe you could say, a couple of minutes about that.
Well, vaccine passports are now in the US essentially handwritten CDC cards. And I assume that they'll eventually be digitized. And in fact, there is a longstanding agenda to produce a digital ID and link it to central bank digital currency, which will be administered through your digital wallet. And it will also be connected to now, as we see, your biomedical history. So your ID is connected to your finance, your medical history, and it's all required to participate in society under the current biomedical security regime, which has come into play through a state of legal exception.
Is this you just worrying, Max, or is there evidence that this is actually going to happen?
Well, in 2016, Bill Gates and his partners set up something called ID 2020, which was an initiative, a massive lobbying operation to produce digital ID and to convince local municipalities that they should administer these. And we're already seeing it happen through smart cards and various apps on the iPhone that require people, for example, public school teachers, to produce their vaccine card digitally or their QR code in order to continue teaching. So it's happening, but ID 2020 is lobbying for it through, in particular, a congressman in Illinois named Bill Foster, who's a complete tool of the financial industry. And this is a wet dream of the financial industry, as I said, because it'll be linked to digital currency. And what Bill Foster said at an ID 2020 event is really chilling. It shows how this is not just about public health or security, it's also about private wealth. He said that once the government has taken those fairly serious biometrics from you, there will be huge opportunities for the commercial sector to leverage that. And to try to get all this started, I introduced the Improved Digital ID Act. Now in Illinois, thanks to the efforts of people like Foster, in order to access your vaccination records, you have to go through Experian, which is a credit rating agency.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that that's already in place and that you have to if your credit is frozen, you have to unfreeze it in order to access your records should be a major red flag. And what Bill Foster wants to do is implement that on a national scale. And he's working through the Gates ID 2020 initiative. Now, where Gates comes in here is that he's already, through a close friend of his, tested this in India, and the results have been horrifying. In India, there's a system called Aadhaar, which is the world's largest digital ID system. It's been implemented through a tech billionaire named Nandan Nilekani, very close friend of Bill Gates. And we reported, Jeremy Lofredo and I, in this piece at the Gray Zone about the campaign for digital IDs and how those behind it are trying to get it in through the vaccine passports, that in the Indian state of Jharkhand, a very poor rural state, throughout 2017, many people died because they had gotten into the Aadhaar system. The Aadhaar system requires you to give all your biometric data to this public-private initiative. And in order to get your monthly ration of rice, for example, or to access any government service, you need your fingerprints and your iris scans. You have to produce that. So many very poor people who may not even be literate, were dying because they couldn't access their rice ration because they either couldn't sign up for this, or the system was being tampered with, or the system failed. I mean, we're talking about large numbers of deaths. It was widely reported throughout Indian media, completely ignored in the West. In fact, it was celebrated by PBS and NPR, a network that Bill Gates has funded to the tune of $20 million since 2002. So Bill Gates personally declared Aadhaar a great success and declared that he wanted to bring it to the West and specifically to the United States. The pandemic has provided the perfect opportunity to introduce these kinds of systems. It's happening in patchwork fashion, but it is happening, and it could ultimately be nationalized. Certainly the consent is there from a large sector of the public.
I want to go long if you're at time-wise, if you're good, because I want to talk a little bit about the people who are refusing and why they're refusing. And while you were talking, Max, this may be a little bit of a digression, but while you're talking, I was thinking of a piece I wrote in 2009, 2010 called The Image of the Beast, which was named after the kinds of movies that that evangelists' children and evangelicals' children were shown in the 70s, 80s, these like low budget Christian films that were all about when the Antichrist comes, he's going to make you digitize and make you implant you with a chip here or here. And then they're going to come and round up the good Christians and hang them and everything. This was the apocalyptic, culture of a 666 and all that. And drawing on biblical language about the image of the beast and making people aware. And I was waiting back then for a rejection. The Democrats, including Chuck Schumer and Obama, had plans for a national biometric system, which I thought would really trigger the Christians because it was actually called BELIEVE. I don't know if you remember BELIEVE, but that was the acronym. And I thought, oh man, this is the fire this time. But nothing came of it. So there was no uprising. And I'm wondering, when I look at the kinds of people who object to the vaccine, this gets passed over in liberal discourse a fair amount because a fair number of young Black people are objecting to taking the vaccine. But of course, you do have evangelicals and people like that. But to me, I've heard a lot of people in, liberal social circles saying, they must be insane. Why would anybody risk their own lives? But to me, my answer has always been, if you're not in those highly educated, well-compensated liberal social circles, all you know is pharmaceutical companies are screwing you, fact A, which is true. Fact B, you don't have much choice over, you have very little autonomy on the job or in the rest of your life. You're not represented politically, you have no voice in how your company is run. Also all true. So this becomes, I personally think we would be better off, they would be better off, people who aren't taking the vaccine, if they took it. I would like, for their sake, for them to take it. I think it's a tragedy when people die and don't have to. But I don't think irrational is the word I would use. I would say principles are coming into play and long-standing forces are coming into play. And they were not going to be persuaded by the same sort of condescending liberal. Do you get what I'm driving at? I guess I'll stop there.
I'm not sure if I.
Okay, well, let me explain
as a question.
that I think the resistance, my feeling is the resistance comes out of long-standing failure to speak on the part of the left, to speak to, broadly defined, to speak to working people in a way they understand, and long-standing injustices. And that personally, I think it would be good if more people took the vaccine, but I think they're not doing it because they've been mistreated in the workplace, they've been ill-served by their government. And so I guess it's a two-part question. One, do you agree with me that more people would be better off if they took this thing? But number two, do you agree with me that there's a kind of understandable set of forces that's causing people to resist taking it?
Well, you can't, the group that is not just resisting the vaccine, but resisting what I call the new normal, which is this entire biomedical security regime and propaganda apparatus that's grown up against the backdrop of 9/11 and Russiagate in this state of exception through the pandemic, is more heterogeneous than the group that angrily and aggressively supports the new normal. That group is mostly uniform. And then you have another group that has decided to go along to get along, because generally they're in an economically precarious situation and they can't afford conflict, or they just simply aren't heavily politicized and don't want to get involved in the ugliness and toxicity, especially in the US, where everything has been framed through the lens of fears of populism and nationalism, and in the course of a culture war. So that group that's more heterogeneous is impossible to stereotype. I mean, you do have right wingers in there who are there because they just see anything the government does as evil. You have a number of left wingers who are concerned about monopoly capital gaining unprecedented control over everything, including people's biology. They don't trust the government. Strangely, I thought there would be more. I'm kind of baffled by the reflexive obedience of large sectors of the left here. But it isn't anymore just about unvaccinated versus vaccinated. I know many people who are fully vaccinated who now see the booster regimen coming in and see these bizarre and exotic restrictions like lockdowns exclusively for the unvaccinated, and they're just disgusted on civil liberties grounds. Of course, though, the entire resistance to this program is legitimate, but the idea that every single person in the entire world needs to take one of these vaccines that has failed on so many of their promises is, to me, unacceptable, and to many other people. It's going to require so much coercion, and we haven't even talked about adverse effects. They do have adverse effects. And if you believe the CDC's VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, it's harming people and injuring people every week. And that's a concern people have. It's a legitimate concern. I went to a press conference of Americans from all walks of life. Many of them had testified in the Senate earlier that day. This was 2 weeks ago. And hearing their stories about being injured by the vaccines was shocking. Most people are not going to be injured by them. This appears to be uncommon, but it's a concern that we have to recognize. But on a population level, the idea that we can vaccinate our way out of the pandemic has, in my view, been totally discredited. And that's why we're going to see in 2022 a focus on therapeutics, on pills people can take. The public health officials will finally accept early treatment after demonizing ivermectin. Like, I don't know if your YouTube video could be taken down because I just said the word ivermectin. It's been called horse paste, but now we're seeing what amounts to Pfizermectin and all these other pills. 2022 will be the year of therapeutics. So it's a tacit admission that the vaccines failed to end the pandemic. So why keep pushing people into a corner and creating this kind of new, very heterogeneous resistance when the vaccine uptake, in my view, has been pretty high across the board and will continue to go up if people are simply encouraged through positive means. And if public health officials now finally accept the reality that it's an individual choice to protect yourself against illness or death in some cases. And I want to make another point that I think is controversial, but I've made it before and it's true, which is that the death toll is being inflated. And that doesn't mean that COVID is not a threat, but it's being inflated and counted in unusual ways to make us think that we're basically living through some kind of genocide and to cut off our critical faculties. A man recently in Auckland, New Zealand, died of gunshot wounds, and he received a COVID test at the time of his death, which came back positive. And so his death, as was reported in New Zealand media, national media, was registered as a COVID death. It was registered as a COVID death because the World Health Organization has advised countries to register anyone who dies with a positive COVID test as a COVID death. And so in the United States, the CDC has a chart on its website, which anyone can see, that states that 94% of those who died with COVID had an average of 4.0 comorbidities. So you see hundreds of thousands of deaths from heart disease where people received a positive COVID test, which are registered as COVID deaths. Colin Powell comes to mind here, someone who is in his 80s, had been fully vaccinated, and had Parkinson's as well as multiple myeloma. And his death was registered as a COVID death. What did he really die of? I mean, Parkinson's and multiple myeloma, those are lethal, debilitating diseases. On that chart, some 13,000 deaths that are registered are noted as poisoning or deliberate self-harm. So people who died of poisoning or suicide had positive COVID tests. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's just a very exotic and unusual way of counting COVID deaths that raises the death toll and should really cause us to reflect on who is dying out there and who is vulnerable and how many of them have been fully vaccinated and what the limits of mass vaccination are. Because when you vaccinate people over 80, well, they can't live forever. It's not a fountain of youth. I mean, eventually your immune system just weakens to the point where it scarcely exists. And so we're seeing, there was a care home in Connecticut that had a COVID outbreak last week, and 8 deaths, and almost 100% of the seniors there had been vaccinated. So that's just what we have to come to expect until there is more emphasis on early treatments, on actually having a real public healthcare system, on, having the confidence in our public healthcare system that Denmark did when it ended all the emergency restrictions. But we've gone from the left advocating for Medicare for all and calling for public healthcare to at least quietly acquiescing as public health officials and pundits call for denying healthcare to the unvaccinated. We've even seen a Colorado hospital deny an organ transplant to a woman simply because she and her donor were unvaccinated. She had to go to Texas to save her own life. And that's something that we are now accepting as triage. So there's just so much. There's so many lives that could be saved here by not cutting ICU beds. Andrew Cuomo, how many ICU beds did that guy cut throughout his tenure as governor? Thousands and thousands and thousands. And then we start
Jerry Brown did too, by the way. I wrote a piece about that.
Jerry Brown did, and the red state governors do it the most. And now we're just looking at the symptoms instead of the cause. The symptoms, there's not enough beds, and the unvaccinated are filling everything up. No, this is about neoliberalism. There should just be more beds. And then finally, so many people, because of the lockdowns and the fear, delayed routine treatments. And many of them died because of that. I mean, including chemotherapy. And now they're coming in and they're flooding hospitals. Look at the reporting right now. The hospitals are full of people who have now decided that they can't wait any longer to have their routine procedures done, but they waited because of the pandemic. So all the hospitals are flooding with people, and they're going to be even more full because of the flu this winter. So COVID isn't the only issue here. It's the response to it that has been absolutely inhuman, and there needs to be some debate about it. And the critics who have criticized and critiqued every other response by the powerful, every other undemocratic overreaction to a crisis, many of them are absent.
Well, I guess we'll have to end on that note, but I will say that it is amazing to me that with so many deaths and such a public health crisis, that nobody's talking about Medicare for all anymore. That nobody's talking about the fact that if you think you're sick, I've just got allergies. That's why I was coughing. But if you think you're sick, you should be able to go to the hospital no matter what it is. You shouldn't even have to guess, what it is. You should just go. If you need antibiotics, you ought to get them. If you need treatment for COVID, you ought to get it. If you need a hospital bed, it ought to be there. That was the operating principle of the progressive left for years. And I don't see it out there anywhere, even as the death toll mounts, not just from COVID, but from underinsurance, poverty, environmental pollution. I wrote a piece, I ran the numbers. Somebody dies every 30 seconds or so from one of those utterly preventable factors, millions of deaths. And our attitude is, well, I guess we can try to lower the Medicare age to 60, but that didn't work out. So I guess we had our day. And that to me pandemic or no pandemic is insane, and in a pandemic is especially insane. But I'll give you the last word.
Right. I mean, why in the pandemic simulations that took place eerily weeks before the pandemic arrived, was that not front and center on the agenda? Having a public healthcare system capable of caring for every person for free. It wasn't there, and it won't be there. And it feels less likely now, given the sort of pathetic response, and obedience of large sectors of the left. But in any case, I think a debate is necessary, and I'm going to continue talking about this where I can at my Rockfin stream, which is called Foreign Agents, from what I consider to be a left perspective, with other people who I think are insightful and sharp critics of the new normal. So check that out, as well as my podcast with Ben Norton, Moderate Rebels, and we'll continue reporting on this at thegrayzone.com.
And this intersection of forces that wants to monitor us, critically important. You have a piece in the Gray Zone about that, so I don't want to leave that out.
Yeah, I mean, the key word, RJ, I mean, I should mention it. The key term here is social credit. And it's something, America's demonized China for implementing, supposedly. But what we have here is a de facto social credit system where your behavior is, your participation in society is conditioned on good behavior according to government or institutional mandates. And that's not a society I want to live in. And I suspect many people watching this don't either. So it's time to speak up and start reflecting on what kind of world we're creating.
And it could be a very dystopian one. So on that note, Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone and Foreign Agents and Moderate Rebels and God knows what else.
A bunch of different brands.
Thanks for your great reporting as always, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for giving me the mic, RJ.
You got it. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.